My name is Daniel Hayes, I'm 29 years old, and 3 months ago I was one step away from losing everything I had ever worked for, not because I was lazy, not because I made terrible decisions, but because life sometimes just decides to hit you when you're already down, and that night, the night everything changed, I had exactly $40 left in my bank account. $40 that stood between me and being thrown out of my tiny apartment by a landlord who had already given me too many chances, a man who didn't believe in excuses, only payments, and that night was my final deadline, the last chance to prove I could still hold my life together, but the truth was I couldn't, because 3 months earlier I had lost my job after a cold, heartless email that started with, due to restructuring, and just like that my stable life collapsed. I went from someone who could afford small luxuries to someone counting every dollar, every meal, every day, hoping something would change, but nothing did. Interviews came and went, promises were made, we'll call you back, but no one ever did, and slowly my savings disappeared until I was left with nothing but stress, fear, and that final $40. I remember staring at my phone that evening, refreshing my bank balance again and again as if it would magically increase, but it didn't, it stayed the same, mocking me, reminding me that I had failed. I hadn't eaten properly that day, just a cheap coffee to trick my stomach into silence, and the apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in, so I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold night, hoping the air would clear my mind, or at least numb the panic building inside me. The streets were quiet, people moving past each other without a second glance, everyone busy with their own lives, their own problems, and for a moment I thought maybe I was invisible too, just another person the world had decided to ignore, and that's when I saw him, sitting on the pavement near a closed store, an old man wrapped in layers of worn-out clothes that barely protected him from the cold, his hands shaking so badly it looked painful. People walked past him like he wasn't even there, like he didn't exist, and I almost did the same. I almost kept walking because I had my own problems, bigger problems. I was about to lose my home, I couldn't afford to help anyone, not anymore. But then he looked up and our eyes met, and there was something in that look that stopped me. It wasn't begging, it wasn't desperation, it was something quieter, something deeper, like he had accepted that no one would help him, like he had already given up on the world, and for some reason that hit me harder than anything else. I stopped walking, my mind telling me to leave, to think about myself for once, but something inside me wouldn't let me move. I remembered something my mother used to say, that your true character shows when you have nothing left to give and you still choose to give, and before I could overthink it, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and looked at the last $40 I had, 2 20s, my rent money, my survival, my last chance, and I stood there arguing with myself, telling myself this was stupid, reckless, irresponsible, that I would regret this in a few hours when I was sitting in the dark with nothing. But at the same time I couldn't ignore the man in front of me, freezing, alone, invisible, so I walked up to him and quietly said, "Sir," and he looked up at me with tired but sharp eyes, and I held out the money and said, "Take it," and for a moment he didn't move, he just stared at me like he didn't understand what was happening, like kindness was something he hadn't seen in a long time. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice weak but steady, and I nodded. "I know, but I want to," even though a part of me knew I couldn't afford it. And slowly he reached out and took the money, his hands shaking. "Why?" he asked, and I didn't have a perfect answer. I just said the first thing that came to my mind, "Because you need it more than I do," even though that wasn't entirely true, but it felt right in that moment, and he looked at me in a way I can't fully explain, like he was trying to understand who I was, and then he said quietly, "Thank you, you have a good heart," and I just nodded and walked away before I could change my mind, before fear could take over, and the entire walk back home my thoughts were screaming at me, telling me I had just ruined everything, that I had made the dumbest decision of my life, that I would pay for this, and when I got back to my apartment the silence felt heavier than ever, the emptiness louder. I sat on the couch in the dark staring at nothing, knowing I had no money, no backup plan, no way to fix what was coming, and hours passed like that until suddenly there was a knock on the door, and my heart dropped because I knew exactly who it was, my landlord, Mr. Collins, coming to end it, to tell me to pack my things and leave, and I stood up slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last, walked to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it, and there he was, just as cold and serious as always, but he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was the same old man from the street, and for a second my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. How could he be here? Why was he here? And before I could say anything, the old man looked at me and smiled slightly. "Good evening," he said, and my voice came out shaky. "You?" And Mr. Collins stepped forward and said, "We need to talk," and I stepped aside, still confused, still trying to process everything, as they both walked into my apartment, and the old man looked around like he was studying everything, not judging, just observing, and then he turned back to me and said, "You gave me everything you had tonight." And I swallowed and nodded, "Yes," and he added, "Even though you're about to be evicted," and I looked at Mr. Collins in shock. "How do you know that?" And Mr. Collins simply said, "I told him," and nothing made sense anymore, until the old man reached into his coat and pulled out a completely different wallet, expensive, clean, filled with cards and money, and calmly said, "My name is Charles Whitmore," and the moment he said it, everything changed, because that name wasn't just a name. It was power, it was wealth, it was the man who owned buildings, companies, entire blocks of the city, including this one, and I felt my legs weaken as I looked between him and Mr. Collins, who confirmed it with a simple nod, and Charles continued, "I like to observe people, to see who they really are when they think no one is watching," and suddenly the street, the cold, the decision I made, it all came rushing back. "You tested me," I said, and he shook his head slightly. "No. You revealed yourself," and there was silence, heavy, overwhelming silence, as he explained how dozens of people walked past him that night, people with more money, more comfort, more stability than me, but none of them stopped, none of them cared, except me, the one person who had the least to give, and yet gave everything. And then he said something that changed my life forever: "I don't invest in businesses anymore, I invest in people." And my heart started pounding as he turned to Mr. Collins and said, "His rent is paid, for the next year," and I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and before I could even react he added, "And I want to offer you a job," and I stood there completely speechless, trying to understand how one decision, one moment of kindness, had turned everything around, and when I finally asked why, he simply said, "Because when you had nothing, you still chose to give," and that night, the night I thought I had lost everything, turned out to be the night I gained a future I never thought possible, and even now, months later, I still think about that moment, about how close I was to walking past him, to choosing myself over someone else, and how different my life would be if I had, because sometimes, the smallest decision, the one that seems the most irrational, the most risky, the most impossible, is the one that changes everything, and the truth is, you never really know who you're helping, or how that one act of kindness might come back to you in ways you never expected.